Hey everyone, welcome to the E2 Effective Elders podcast. E2 is devoted to coaching your elder team to win by providing biblical and practical resources in authentic relationships. E2 wants nothing more than to equip you to move God's kingdom forward in the place you're serving Jesus. Visit us at e2elders.org and please share this good word with others.
Hey friends, thanks for tuning into our E2 podcast. We are so very grateful that you're following along with us. And as always, we always begin with a word of thanks to CDF Capital for making this podcast possible. They have been incredible investors in leaders of churches, particularly elders, and we appreciate the partnership these many years. A very special welcome to Dusty Rubeck, who is CEO, president of CDF Capital, and a longtime friend and brother in Christ. Welcome, Dusty, to our podcast.
Thank you, Gary. It's great to be here today.
Well, and it's a privilege. I know that you are a long way away in Texas, and we are certainly grateful for the platform of Zoom that makes this possible. We're very grateful.
Indeed. And greetings to all of your listeners as well.
Thank you. And Dusty, you know, I've known you for many, many years, and you have a real heart for elders that are leading the local church. And in this season where we hope to get a green light and to move back into a more normal routine, can you give us a strong word as elders for life after COVID? We want to listen to your heart as you speak into ours.
Absolutely, Gary. Thanks for the invitation. And since you first mentioned this to me about a week ago, this has just been going through my head quite a bit over the last week of what I might be able to share. So I would start with these foundational comments. You'll be familiar with this. You know, at CDF Capital, we tend to look at a healthy church, a growing church, a balanced church needs three types of capital. Financial capital, which is what CDF Capital has been best known for. But it takes a lot more than financial capital for a church to be healthy. There are many churches that have plenty of financial resources, but still aren't doing well. So it also requires leadership capital and ultimately spiritual capital. And we believe when God brings the right blend or the right balance of those three types of capital, that's when transformation begins to happen in that church. And so we simply refer to it as transformational capital. I tend to use the filter of those three types of capital in everything that I look at with churches as we're consulting with churches these days. So I think primarily I wanted to talk a little bit about questions today. So you mentioned the idea of getting back to normal. And of course, I'm hearing that from church leaders all across the country. I would like to start with this challenge to the elders who are listening. Are you absolutely certain that you've been asking the right questions? Uh-huh. Are you absolutely certain that what you want is to get back to normal? Are you absolutely certain that February 2019 is what normal should look like? Is that really what we want to go back to? And I think it begins with asking those right questions. So when I look at those questions through the lens of the three types of capital, I'll start with financial capital, not because it's most important. I think it's least important, and I want to move towards spiritual capital. But with financial capital, I would challenge leaders of churches, elders of churches, to begin planning differently. Mm-hmm. You know, if you were to go back 12 months ago, and I was to say to you in March of 2020, every one of your churches nationwide is going to be barred from meeting in your building. Would you have done anything differently financially over the last 12 months? Yeah. As you got into this, did you have enough financial reserves? We've been working with hundreds of churches around the country, and we found probably 20% that had enough reserves that this really hasn't shaken them yet. Mm-hmm. We've probably another 70% who have just enough, not too much, and then those who are really caught short. So did you have enough reserves to protect your church and the programs of your church? And perhaps more importantly, did you have enough to help serve your community? Mm-hmm. You know, who is suffering the most in this pandemic? When you just look at your church community, who are the members who are suffering the most, and have you been able to adequately serve them not just with spiritual resources, but with financial resources. Gary, I'm concerned that with the Paycheck Protection Program and a couple of things like that, I realize what a financial blessing that can be for churches to have that available to them. But I'm really concerned that if churches haven't adequately met the needs of the neediest, that those people will come out of this looking for the government to save them.
Right.
And I think that's very unfortunate. And I think it's very unfortunate if church leaders are looking at, I mean, the entire Paycheck Protection Plan, we've told churches apply for it and read the fine print. I mean, it's a government program. The devil is literally in the details, is it not? Be very cautious. And we haven't seen anything yet that we think is objectionable. There seems to be adequate protections. But my lands, when the government says to you, you can't meet in your building, we're going to offer you a loan to pay your ministers, and then we have a, quote, forgiveness program. Am I the only one that's concerned about the unintended consequences of that? Anyhow, the point is, when you look at financial capital after this, I really think we ought to plan differently going into the future. Keep in mind, this can happen again. And if it's not this, it can be something like this. Much of my leadership at CDF Capital, I've paid attention to the life of Joseph. And when Joseph had that vision that we're in a time of plenty, but always after a time of plenty, there will be a time of drought, of great need. And he built reserves all those years so that he could be a blessing to the nations. God could use him in that way. I would hope that from the financial capital perspective, we might plan differently once we get through this. Leadership capital. I would challenge you all to think differently. And it goes back to what I said before. Is February of 2020 actually the normal that we want to get back to? Let's not try to get back to normal. Let's not return to business as usual. I think we Christians, we church leaders, ought to be planning and thinking differently. We need to do something unusual.
Yes.
We need to do what the world doesn't expect. We need to do what the world doesn't realize we even could do. We need to think about every part of our program and say, is that really the need? I mean, I think about larger churches with multiple services, and it's very common that we rush everybody in. We've got a 60-minute service, and then we say, spend some time in fellowship, as long as it's not more than 5 or 10 minutes, because we need to get the next service going. When we've been away from each other for a few months, do we really want to walk into a building, be rushed in, have bright lights, a rock concert, and then rush out? I think not. And I think we need to be thinking differently about every part of what we do in our services when we come back together, and also to be thinking about what are the opportunities that God has opened up that we're able to take advantage of now, whether it's digital, whatever that is. How do we keep the best of those things going into the future? So from a leadership perspective, think differently. And finally, most importantly, spiritual capital. I would challenge elders particularly that it's time to start counting things differently, measuring things differently. Rather than just seats and dollars, how do we count spiritual impact? I'm very passionate about this one. You know, it's an interesting thing. What happens to the church when the church building is taken away?
Right.
We're seeing it right now in thousands of congregations. We're seeing what they're made of. But one of the things we're seeing is the folly of bigger barns, right? It doesn't matter if you've got a $100,000 building or a $100 million campus. We have all had the opportunity to see what is our ministry made of, what's our ministry built on when that building is taken away.
Right.
If all that you measure in, I'm going to count myself as guilty of this at CDF Capital. If all we measure is attendance and income, then how are we different than a football team with a stadium? If all we measure is attendance and income, how are we different than a concert venue? You see, here's the thing. While participation in church might lead to transformation, participation is not in and of itself transformation, and it doesn't even measure it very, very well. So for elders of congregations, I think now to say, when we come back, how are we going to define success, whatever that means? How are we going to define faithfulness? How are we going to define impact? Mm-hmm. It's time for us to be asking those questions in a different way, well before services open up again and we slip right back into doing business as usual. Mm-hmm. You know, this whole concept of social isolation, I Googled it. I know the term has been around for a long time. I honestly can't ever remember hearing it or paying attention to it until a couple of months ago. And you think about this time of social isolation, social distance, if you will. This is causing a lot of pain for a lot of people. But I only know one remedy, and I've been sharing this with church leaders across the country. I only know one remedy to social distance, and that's spiritual intimacy. Mm-hmm. And if we can't use this time to change how we focus on things and realizing that spiritual intimacy is what we have to focus on now and in the future. I mean, as shepherds, as elders in your congregation, you probably could go through the list of every person in your congregation and they would fit in this quadrant someplace. There are people who are very socially intimate with others, but they're spiritually distant. There are people who are socially distant and spiritually distant. I mean, those are people really on the fringe who are really at risk right now. Where we want to be is people that, yes, they have social intimacy with people in the church, but primarily it's all driving towards spiritual intimacy.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So I would suggest this to you as elders. If you do not pay attention to these matters, who will?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, if this isn't the charge of a shepherd, then what is? Mm-hmm. I mean, everybody else who is involved in leadership in the world, they are measuring things in the world in worldly ways. And unfortunately, we measure much of what happens in churches in worldly ways. There is nothing easy about measuring spiritual growth. There is nothing easy about measuring spiritual health or spiritual intimacy. But if you and I, as elders and leaders, aren't doing it, who else will? I think it's time to ask much deeper questions and much tougher questions to begin to focus on those things. So, Gary, those would be the top of mind things that are in my heart right now.
Well, you've said a good word for all of us. You know, prior to COVID, we're all in Lane A doing ministry. Lane A shuts down, and we're all forced to merge into Lane B, life during COVID. And now when the Lane B is going to close down and we get a green light, we don't want to go back to Lane A. We want to go to Lane C. And to do ministry differently, we have to think differently, just like you said. The challenge is for elders to think differently, because how we think determines how we act or how we lead. No, that's a very good word, Dusty. And particularly for elders, that we are thinking about the spiritual nature of the sheep. And we can't expect the sheep to be spiritual if we do not lead by example. So yes. Now, you're the first person to make mention of the issue of social isolation, this social distancing, that we counter that with spiritual intimacy with God.
Imagine, Gary, if we came out of this with millions of Christians who were closer to God because they couldn't go to church.
Right. Yeah.
Imagine what, I mean, isn't that what we... Isn't that what we dream of? I mean, that would change the world. That would change the world.
That would be a game changer. Absolutely.
That would be a game changer. And we would come back, and it wouldn't be business as usual. It would not be getting back to normal. It would be getting back to something much, much greater than that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, this is very intriguing, because I'm doing so many of these interviews, and I see themes, threads from all of you, bringing the very same discoveries to bear. So I deeply, deeply appreciate that. Well, Dusty, again, thanks for your time. Thanks for your investment in the church, the bride of Christ, and particularly in elders. We are truly grateful.
Well, we are grateful to be a partner with you, and we're so pleased with the work, Gary, that you and your team are doing. And just if there's anything that I or my team can do to serve the leaders that you serve, don't hesitate to ask. God bless you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.